Good morning. I think we're ready to get underway this morning. Good to be back. I appreciate Adam covering for me last week, and we're back in our study of Acts this morning. We're in Acts 10. Hard to understate the importance of the story we covered this morning. We might not be here without the story of Cornelius and his interactions with Peter. So just very important story in the early church and in the history of the church. So for that, let's look back at where we were 2 weeks ago. Heard the story of Saul's conversion, and Luke had told us that Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples in the beginning of our lesson last time. So Saul had asked for permission to travel 175 miles to continue to try to persecute the Christian religion, round up disciples, bring them back to Jerusalem. And just as he's about to get there, confronted by Jesus face to face, brought the truth of the gospel, a turning point in Saul's life. Jesus asking, "Why are you persecuting me?" Says that to him 2 times, and Saul is stricken blind and not eating or drinking. And you kind of assume and think that maybe that was the only thing that would have turned Saul's life around. Such an encounter with Christ as that. God sends a believer to minister to Saul. Ananias is given direction and a vision to go and restore Saul's sight, and Ananias does not want to do that. I think we can understand that. Saul is one of the greatest persecutors of the Christian religion in the history of the church, and yet Ananias does take the step that God has called him to take. And in the face of meeting this person who would have likely killed him maybe even just a few hours earlier, Ananias calls him brother. Saul approaches him in love and in a loving spirit, and makes all the difference as he heals Saul, restores his sight, and immediately Saul is baptized and begins his ministry right away. Wastes no time. As soon as his strength is restored, he's in the synagogues. He's preaching about Jesus. He has completely changed, a 180 from where he had been. And so he is obviously a zealous and gifted speaker. He had been that before when he was anti-Christian. He continues to be that as he is carrying forth the gospel message. And because of the fact he's so effective and he is so bold in his speaking, he's almost always under the threat of death and persecution himself. And in this case, he escapes in a basket. He's lowered outside the walls. And Galatians tells us it takes him 3 years, but eventually Saul makes his way to Jerusalem to meet the apostles. And despite the passage of time, they're still too afraid to meet with him. He was such an effective persecutor. So Barnabas comes back on the scene and comes to Saul's defense, represents his interests and his character to the apostles. So Barnabas is somebody who had taken the time to interact with somebody who was much different than him, even dangerous to him, listened to Saul's story, and then took the time to convince the apostles of his trustworthiness. So they accept Saul in part because of, well, I would say mostly because of the defense that Barnabas provides. So Saul's in Jerusalem for a while, and while he's there, it says he moves about freely and demonstrates 2 traits that will follow him throughout the rest of his life. He is a very bold and sometimes offensive and sometimes controversial speaker, and controversy did follow him his whole life. He kept finding out that people were wanting to kill him in many cases as he's witnessing for Christ. He's so bold in the way that he speaks that people are very offended by him, and they want to silence him as a result. So even from Jerusalem, Saul has to flee, and he ends up fleeing to Tarsus at the end of this part of his story. Certainly a lot more to come in Saul's story in Acts. The last section that we covered a couple weeks ago, we picked back up with Peter, who's going to be integral to today's story. Peter had healed a couple of folks near the Mediterranean coast. He healed Aeneas, who'd been paralyzed for 8 years, and then raised a woman from the dead named Dorcas. And so as we picked back up in Peter's story here, we can see that he's still actively ministering to the Jews through the power of the Holy Spirit. So the power of the Holy Spirit is at work in Peter still, and he is interacting with these Jewish folks and converting them to Christianity. But the very last thing we read, if you remember in that section, was that he had moved in with a tanner who was had an occupation that was very unclean, and we began to see this beginning a shift of mindset for Peter, that he's beginning to lower his resistance to ministering to the Gentiles, and so that's where we'll pick up this week. These miracles lead us right into today's story. So last week, or the last time we were together, God reached out by winning over the worst persecutor. This week, God is reaching out to every person. So there's been some limitations put on the Christian faith by the people who are spreading it in part. These are Jewish folks who are ministering mostly to Jewish people. And today we're going to see the doors opened wide for the Christian religion, for the good news, the gospel. So we see this good Gentile soldier who gets a vision from God. And then almost simultaneously, Peter is also experiencing a vision from God. And the story we cover today are how these two visions work together to bring these two together, to open the doors of the church wide to everyone, despite how they might feel about each other socially. And they kind of overcome this discomfort because of these visions that God is providing. So we're in Acts 10 as we get underway this morning. Acts 10, 1 through 3. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day, at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. Distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. So Caesarea is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It's about 32 miles north of Joppa. This is where Peter had been stationed. He had been there ministering. He was staying with Simon. And so this is a very important port city on the Mediterranean Sea, the largest. It is serving also as the capital of this Roman province. So this is an influential city that is really important to the Roman government at this time. And so this actually becomes the first city to have Gentile Christians in the non-Jewish church. So this is the first report we get of that. So who's Cornelius? He's a centurion, which is a Roman officer in charge of 100 soldiers. And as a Roman officer, he's a Gentile who ate the wrong food. He hung out with the wrong people. He was swearing allegiance to Caesar. He was uncircumcised and unclean. All of the things that a good Jewish person like Peter would have worked their whole lives to avoid. Cornelius was everything different than what the Jews were. But if we look a little closer here in verses 1 through 3, how does Cornelius depart from the stereotypical Roman soldier, the stereotypical Gentile person of this time? So what do we learn about him early on? Okay, so he's a God-fearing guy. Doesn't probably understand even everything about why he is, but he's seeking God, isn't he? Okay. What else? He's God-fearing. These. Generous. Yeah. He was generous as opposed to expecting to be served, which I think that would have been unusual, wouldn't it? So he is certainly wealthy in his position, a very influential, important, but rather than seeking more for himself, he's a generous giver. It says he's a regular prayer too, so he's seeking after God in his actions, in his thoughts, in his prayers. Hebrews 11:6 would say that God rewards those who earnestly seek him. Cornelius is someone who's seeking after God. Doesn't understand yet probably how to get there. And so God is going to help Cornelius to better understand him. And he's going to use Peter to do this and pick up there. So any other thoughts on that before we move forward? So Cornelius is different and offensive in many ways to Jewish people, and yet he's working at trying to be something different. Okay, 4 through 8. 4 through 8. Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened, and he sent them to Joppa. So what's the message of Cornelius's vision? The angel says, "Your prayers and your gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering to God." So if we look at the Greek a little bit, trying to understand what is meant by memorial offering, the Greek is kind of suggesting that Cornelius's generosity has caused him to be remembered by God in heaven. So God has seen the good works that Cornelius is doing. He sees that Cornelius is seeking after him, that he's pursuing more knowledge. And because of the things that Cornelius has done, it's caused God to remember him in heaven. So Cornelius is faced with this choice that seems easy for him, but he's got a choice. Am I going to listen to this and send for Peter? Or am I going to just continue on in the way that I'm going? And so Cornelius makes the decision here to act. He sends these guys to Joppa to go in and get Peter and bring him back to him. So that's the message that is given. So we see on this side, on the Cornelius side, that he's being influenced by God's work in his life, and he's going to need a willing partner on the other side. And that's where we pick up in 9 through 13, Acts 10, 9 through 13. About noon, the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. And then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." So Peter is in prayer. These guys are en route to Joppa to meet him. And Peter's in prayer, and it says that he's hungry while he's praying. And then he falls into a trance as the meal's being prepared and the prayers are sort of wrapping up. He falls into a trance, and it seems almost like a cruel joke, doesn't it? He's hungry, and he sees all this food coming down on what I would imagine or picture to be like a sail dropping all of these animals in front of him, and it's like a joke of, these are all the kind of food you can't eat. No, you're hungry. These are all the things you're not supposed to eat, and these are the things that show up to him in his vision. So according to Jewish law, there's certain things that are forbidden to be eaten. If you've ever read Leviticus 11, the list is quite long. There's a whole bunch of things in there that the Jewish people are supposed to avoid when it comes to food sources, okay? So these laws made it difficult for the Jews to eat with the Gentiles, and because the Gentiles were partaking of things that were unclean to the Jews. And so it was kind of just another way for them to be separated. These very strict food laws caused this big separation. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, yeah. It is opening up that door, isn't it? A door that didn't seem like it could be open. And it's going to be important, I think, what you're saying, Jim, to Peter as he shows up in a few verses to just learn how the angel was interacting with the Gentile. It's going to help break down some of those barriers, because Peter was no doubt skeptical, and we hear that in some of the things he has to say. He's skeptical of this, and so the fact that the angel is interacting with the Gentiles is important. And this vision is important because if these animals are no longer forbidden to be eaten, then maybe it's also no longer forbidden for Jews to interact with Gentiles, because a big part of the separation was the way they lived their lives, what they would eat, how they would eat, the types of culture that they had. And so Peter is seeing these animals coming out of heaven on a sheet, and the barriers are already being broken down as a result. 14 through 16. "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. So Peter is in this trance. He's being shown all these animals, and what do you think he's feeling here as all these things are happening and appearing to him, and hears God's voice? What do you think he's thinking? Yeah. 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 He couldn't understand, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So complete change for him, right, in the way that he would approach it, against everything he had ever known or been taught. He's been shown in this vision. Anything else? I think we can assume here that up until this point, Peter would have seen Cornelius, a Gentile Roman officer, someone who could not possibly be a follower of Christ. Now, we'd seen him and John in Samaria, amazed by the fact that the Holy Spirit was coming upon the Samaritans who were ministered to by Philip. He was living with an unclean person in Simon the tanner. So these barriers are beginning to be broken down in Peter, and yet he would still be convinced that his views about the Gentiles were correct, that maybe these situations were a special occasion or things that God might have been able to accomplish, but that wasn't going to be the norm, that these Jewish traditions and by extension biases were going to still be in place. It was really hard for him. And we're going to see him overcome those biases here. But we're going to hear in Galatians from Paul, or we have heard from him, that Peter continued these biases periodically throughout the rest of his life. It was really hard for him to accept that the Gentiles could be part of the kingdom of God. So God's not kidding, okay? And probably he knows Peter. Well, he does know Peter better than anyone. And so it took him 3 different times. He shows this same trance, the same vision 3 different times. Trying to drive home to Peter that these things that you have called unclean are now no longer unclean. God has made them clean. So while he's thinking about this, he hears a knock at the door, 17 through 23. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of this vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you, so get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them. So Peter went down and said to the men, I am the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. And then in verse 23 it says, then Peter invited the men into his house to be guests. So in verse 20, here in the NIV, it says, do not hesitate. So these guys have arrived, and I don't want you to hesitate. I want you to go with them. New King James Version says, doubting nothing. So you probably have your doubts about these people who have arrived, but I'm saying don't doubt, go. Without misgivings in the NASB, without wondering if it's all right in the easy-to-read version. So huge moment for Peter here. Okay, he's seen this vision, and now immediately these guys are showing up at the door, and the Spirit is saying, don't think about whether this is okay or not, just go. Just go. Don't hesitate, just go. So how had Peter's vision prepared him for the arrival of these guys? How might he have responded without the vision? How might he respond now? What do you think? Mm-hmm. So pre-vision, these are people to be avoided. Now, he had shown some proclivities to minister in ways to people that are different than his background, but for the most part, Peter was... Yeah, yeah. You want me to travel 30 plus miles to go see a Roman soldier who's just as likely to kill me as even invite me into the house. Could have been a trap. Could have been some skepticism for sure, but this vision that Peter had received had changed his mindset, and God didn't give him much time to process it. He's like, the vision ends, they're knocking at the door. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the things that we would see as sinful, that's what they saw these things. Eating that animal is a sin. So God is saying it's not a sin anymore. These are now acceptable and okay. That's a good point. And now these people who represent the very essence of everything that is wrong in the world want you to go and talk to this person. So God could have communicated the gospel directly to Cornelius. He'd taken the time to send an angel to interact with him. So why do you think that he sent these men to Peter to ultimately take Peter to be the one to deliver the gospel? God didn't do this the easy way. What do you think? Yeah. Don't you get the feeling this is just as much for Peter? You know, Philip had gone directly to Samaria and interacted with these people that were, but Peter was reluctant to be part of such things. And so you get the impression that Cornelius needs to be converted, no doubt. He needs to hear the gospel. That could have been anybody. It could have even been the angel. It could have been God himself. Peter needed to be the one to do it because Peter needed to see this take place firsthand. He had kind of arrived after the fact almost in Samaria, and so this is going to hammer home this new point of view that Peter needed to see. So to his credit, surely still filled with skepticism, he invites these messengers to his house, or to Simon's house, and then they spend the night. They're going to head out the next day. So, okay, 23 through 26. The next day, Peter started out with them, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The following day, he arrived in Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence. But Peter made him get up. "Stand up," he said. "I am only a man myself." So Peter is really nervous, certainly apprehensive about visiting, but on the other side, Cornelius is super excited, right? He's called his relatives in. His close friends, they're all at the house. Peter comes in, and he bows down before him like Peter is something to be revered in and of himself. So Peter continues what the disciples had always done throughout Acts, to point people to Jesus rather than themselves. So as Peter enters, Cornelius is giving him respect that Peter is going to try to redirect and say, I don't deserve this. I'm only a man. And sets the tone from the beginning that this interaction will be about Christ and not about Peter. 27 through 29. While talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. He said to them, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection. May I ask why you sent for me?" So Peter lets them know, I'm not that excited to be here. Okay, I'm uncomfortable.